All right. Well, let's jump in. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Perspectives in Professional Psychology. I'm Dr. Lance Garrison. I'm Dean for the College of Professional Psychology at the Chicago School. And today we're exploring an often overlooked topic in the conversation about diversity and inclusion, which is culturally affirming mental health care for individuals with hearing differences. To that end, we are very excited. We've got Dr. Nicholas Gala joining us, a faculty member in our PsyD clinical psychology program in Washington, D.C. Dr. Gala has devoted much of his professional life to advancing a culturally responsive model of care for the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I'm so glad to have him here. Dr. Gala, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So to begin, let's just right out of the gate, could you share a little bit about your background and what led you to focus on mental health care for individuals with hearing differences?
Sure. So my clinical practice right now, I'm a clinical psychologist. My focuses are in forensic psychology, neuropsychology, and this background of having deaf sensitivity to deaf cultural practices and language impacts on these clinical work. Interest in this I stumbled upon it, to be honest. I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is the largest deaf population per capita. And so just growing up, I kind of became aware of people and the deaf culture through sign language that was pretty prevalent around. Then had several friends who knew ASL, American Sign Language abbreviated. And I would ask them occasionally, hey, what's the sign for this? What's the sign for that? And I slowly built my language and repertoire. Well, I stayed at Rochester for my undergrad at the University of Rochester, who has a phenomenal ASL department at the time. They still do. I'm pretty sure of that. And I decided to kind of make a major of American Sign Language as I was also studying psychology and neuroscience. The program was so welcoming. The ability for me to acquire the language was not just easy, but incredibly fun. And I learned about the culture and the diversity that's within the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I just really got impassioned with it. I also found out the unfortunate piece that oftentimes they're marginalized or they're not necessarily always brought to the forefront of medical ideas and interventions. And so I thought, I can continue my passion and my joy for the culture and the community while also tying in my clinical work and hopefully being able to one day provide services for a marginalized population, being kind of sensitive to that culture and the linguistic impacts.
So did you find that it was kind of this slow evolution of your interest in this area, or was there some sort of defining moment or personal experience that really deepened your commitment to this work?
I don't necessarily see something as one defining feature, but at the same time, I also don't think it was slow progression. I think it really started with me just embracing the idea of, hey, let me go try and learn ASL through these classes offered, and this accidental stumble into really being impassioned and joyful of it. I actually picked it up as a third major my junior year in undergrad. And so it was not anything that was kind of slow building. It was okay, let me just go all in and learn this. And I've had the ability to kind of maintain that skill and my involvement with the deaf community since.
So I'm guessing, based on what you said, is the right word fluent in ASL?
People have feelings about terms of fluent. I'm definitely not a
Right.
native signer, but I've picked up skills enough that I can be competent and linguistically sensitive to provide skills to the deaf and hard of hearing. I can hold conversations. I'm conversational. I have feelings about the term fluent, but I'm definitely functional and capable of providing services in ASL.
Wonderful. So for listeners who may not be familiar, how do you distinguish between the medical and the cultural models of understanding hearing differences?
Yeah. So usually when you first jump into deaf studies or deaf cultural practices, one of the first things you generally learn about are these two kind of attempts to define through research this community that and subculture. Oftentimes a medical model takes this idea that hearing loss is a deprivation. There's an inability to hear, and thus, let's go in there and try to fix it with ways that we can. Ways that medicine has attempted to fix hearing are with things like cochlear implants, hearing aids, and assistive hearing devices of other kinds. And usually with that, you have language that kind of gets assigned or ascribed to that kind of model. You have the term deafness kind of as an illness. You have oftentimes a lowercase d as opposed to a capital D representing a culture and community. You have hearing impaired, limited hearing, and different terms of that nature kind of ascribed to that medical model. Again, the emphasis is there's a loss of something. Let's go in there and try to reestablish it or support the growth of that back.
Right.
The cultural model, however, takes it a little bit differently, celebrates the uniqueness of not being able to hear by saying, listen, we're not any different than anyone else. We can do everything that a hearing person can. We just need to have a language that's visual based. And so the cultural model takes on this idea of a shared language, which is the heart of the deaf community, oftentimes ASL or various signs across the world. And from that, they build this unique culture of rich experiences they've had, some hurdles and discrimination that they've faced in the past, a shareness with open communication, access of identity, development of identity. And through this model, there's this supportive encouragement of, hey, let's stand here and be a community that can do just like anyone else can. We don't need to be fixed. We need to have accessibility.
Yeah. It's yeah, that's fascinating because as much as the medical model has done for the world in terms of disease remediation, development of antibacterial agents, antiviral agents, the incredible technological developments and surgical interventions, it does have that limitation. It's a view of the world that is in large part based on a deficit model, right? It's identifying what's wrong. And so I think that that is an incredible limitation. And as I hear you talk about deaf culture, if that's the right word, that it's not necessarily among that community viewed as a deficit, right? It's a natural aspect of the diversity of human experience and has its own kind of center, its own sort of culture. And within the culture, maybe more broadly, it's not viewed as something wrong. It's a natural expression of human diversity and should be valued and celebrated and supported for what it is. And it's an aspect of diverseness among the human experience.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful way of explaining it as well.
Yeah. So as a clinician, as a psychologist, what are some of the most common misconceptions that you think we hold about working with the deaf or hard of hearing clients?
It's a good question. I think misperceptions, I don't know if there's obviously biases and unfortunately discrimination, but I think the biggest concern isn't necessarily any of that. It's the lack of foresight to think about this group and to think about how using a different language or having a cultural model versus a medical model approach really can change a lot of what our interpretations are within psychological assessments, with therapy, with what's sensitive culturally as recommendations. And I think it's more so a blindness. Now, if you think of this as far as possible biases that come up, specific ones, you have kind of the stereotype ones, such as deaf people can all read lips. That's not necessarily true. Some may be able to a little bit, some can't, but that's actually more of a derogatory type statement and a very, very specific one. There's other ideas, again, this idea, we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but this idea of audism, where there's this superiority of the hearing over deafness. And I think there's a little bit of that bias within our work sometimes when we think about accessibility to types of measurements that are appropriate for a deaf person. The language we use during interactions with deaf people, such as hearing terms such as, oh, did you hear that? Or that ringing, or these terms in our language that as individuals who may hear don't recognize necessarily are indicating these things that may not be available or accessible. So I think those are kind of the main biases and ideas. But again, I want to emphasize the fact that it's more so a blindness to this population and the need for them to be heard and seen.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting. I think that, as I've spent time thinking about our conversation tonight and kind of reflecting on my own experience, you talk about sign language and as a variant of just a language expression, I can see, as I move through my world, traveling a lot with the position that I'm in, I often do I walk through the world, whether it's a city street or at a college campus, and I'm very used to hearing people speak different languages. And it always piques my interest because I'm just interested in people generally, being a psychologist, but it doesn't pull me in the same way as when I see someone using ASL. There's something that is uh, culturally divergent about that kind of pulls me in that direction. And so I can see how that can feel marginalizing, how that can, there's a separateness that gets created around that. And so I'm curious in terms of the experience of that community for someone like me walking through the world who gives a head turn when you see someone using ASL, American Sign Language. In your work with this community, how is that experience? Is that an othering thing when someone gives a head turn or looks a little bit too long to a group of people who are using ASL?
So I appreciate the question. I do want to also just clarify that I don't want to be a representative for the entire
Sure, sure, sure,
community
sure.
with my statements, but I can share some experiences, some comments, and opinions that are out there. And also recognizing that there are very much so a lot of diversity of opinions about these matters in the culture itself. The one thing I want to kind of emphasize here is the term divergent doesn't sit well with me. I don't think there's necessarily anything divergent. I think it's just a aspect of our community and our culture's humanity.
Yeah,
Again, it just isn't oftentimes observed, perhaps because there might not be a large deaf community within a particular area, or maybe at worst, there's suppressive natures or oppressive features going on. And I
yeah,
think that what captures us is we see something that's unique and we
yes,
oftentimes don't interact with it. And I think what's
yeah,
making us more aware is the fact, wow, look at what these individuals can do.
yeah,
And it's something that I don't necessarily know what to do because I don't necessarily interact in this visual world that is going on. So I like to just clarify that point to understand again, not necessarily divergent or different, but maybe just a different aspect that may not be as prevalent within the greater
yeah,
community.
yeah,
Now, specific to the idea of kind of lingering and looking, I think that's a lot of hearing people when they're first engaging in the deaf community, or maybe not at all, but coming to contact. It's just like if you were to kind of eavesdrop on someone having a conversation, like
yeah,
it's very rude. Now, what's interesting though is a lot of individuals within the deaf community are very open and very wanting to bring you in and or share aspects of the culture and be seen. And so what's a little bit different is in the deaf community, if you were to acknowledge that you were watching, or if you happen to have maybe a little bit of sign and introduced yourself, you might actually be, oh, hey, and be brought into the communication and or again, that prevalency of access to communication and language might allow you to watch them have a conversation.
yeah,
Whereas with the hearing community, even if we were to be like, hey, I'm Dr. Gala, the others that are still talking might still be like, that's a little odd. You don't
yeah,
what are you doing? So, yeah, just make yourself known, make it
yeah.
known that you're interested, and I think that that's culturally sensitive and
Sure.
a good thing to do.
Like anything, lingering too long is a little bit rude. And
Exactly.
I'm glad you called me out on the use of the word divergent, because that's probably an inappropriate use. It's a uniqueness that grabs attention, right?
Exactly.
Because it does for many of us, I think it is a unique experience to see that. And it's a rare experience. It kind of leads me into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, we pointed out that individuals with hearing differences are, they're sometimes left out of the DEI conversation, particularly when it comes to mental health. So why Why is it that you think that exclusion happens? And what can we do to change that, to be more inclusive?
I love that question. It asks about something that's a hurdle, and then how can we overcome that hurdle with
Yeah.
some avenues. I like that the idea again is going back to this idea. It's usually a small community within the greater whole. And
Yes.
so again, it's this idea of just not being observed or thought of. And when we think of diversity as it's kind of the key term here, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the things that we typically go to as hearing individuals are things like race, gender, sexuality, which are all very important. But one of the very last things within this idea of diversity of a human experience is disability or differences in embodied experiences. And so, if we include that as another way, which is absolutely is, of individuals being diverse, that's oftentimes one of the very last things thought of. And so that's where I encourage people to think about it's not just DEI, but I would slap on A, accessibility. And so accessibility programming to individuals with different body needs, how we can include them into society a bit more rather than either marginalizing them, having them identify their own strategies of to navigate this world and other things like that. So that's my experience with why they're oftentimes left out is just again this idea of not really being seen. Ways we could kind of work to overcome that are things like this, having a phenomenal podcast to talk about these issues. If you're in an area like Washington, D.C., I'm very fortunate that it has Gallaudet University, one of the biggest cultural mesh points of the deaf community because of higher education for these individuals. Rochester, New York, with NTID, National Institute of Technology. If you're within those areas or other areas that have known communities of the deaf culture, get out there and start exploring. Maybe linger a little too long and just introduce yourself so that you engage and start interacting and you pick up on the cultures. You pick up on the various attitudes, personalities, and experiences of these individuals. I think also more academically, we can take individuals like myself, and there's plenty more, way more knowledgeable than me, who study the deaf culture, who study linguistics, who study clinical work and the intersections of these things, and listen to the research, promote the research. And yeah, those would be the primary ways.
Let me ask you, Dr. Gala, are you, as a practicing psychologist, are you doing work with this community right now?
Yes. I actually am currently, shockingly, kind of having two open cases right now. Both are in a forensic realm. I can't really speak too much about that because they're open cases. But yeah, and I can say that what I'm ultimately finding my role is in these situations is yes, to provide my clinical opinion of what's going on culturally, sensitively, and linguistically, but more so as an educator, which
Mm,
plays perfectly with my role with the Chicago School being associate professor to be, hey, let me just educate this jury or let me educate this judge or this attorney on
yeah.
these different matters that are at play.
So, because from a personal place, I want to ask you, for hearing clinicians who want to be better allies for this community, what are some of the practical steps that we can take to become more genuine advocates and partners in this space?
Yeah, I think it can be kind of two ways. And again, it is kind of regionally specific because I do want to be recognizant that not every community, the greater communities, have deaf cultures or deaf community members that are large. I'm sure there's always going to be a deaf member out there somewhere, but a community that you can interact with may not be there. But I think one wonderful way is to just pick up literature, read about the culture, talk to people if you happen to know what do you call it, who happen to be engaged in the culture or have codas, children of deaf adults, if you know of someone, talk about their experiences, educate through readings and get the history. If you have the ability to go out to the community and there's deaf clubs where there's a community coming together to celebrate their heritage and culture, go out there. You will be met, I will be honest, with various opinions of your presence and what that means. And you have to kind of, as a hearing person, recognize and respect that. But if you have that opportunity, you will come across those people who want to teach, who want to be seen, and who want to advocate for their group as well. And then you have two wonderful things. You have someone wanting to advocate and be seen, mixed with someone who wants to learn authentically and really. And then you got yourself a relationship that can go on and continue exposure. I also want to say, lastly, with that, the idea of learning ASL, it is a language of itself, legitimately. And so it can be kind of difficult for some if you're not fluent in it. But even if you just pick up finger spelling or some of the basics, that can oftentimes be the gateway in to other experiences and more development of your language skills in ASL and just a greater understanding of the community holistically as well, if that makes sense.
I think it makes complete sense because I think about it from a broader cultural context. When you look at um, you know to the degree that you can, when you look at cultures as units, we have many different cultures across our life experience that we get exposure to. Like any culture that's different from your own, when you try to enter into that, when you try to engage and explore with that, particularly history of certain cultures, there can be a little bit of skepticism there, a little bit of concern about, okay, well, why are you interested? What do you want from this experience? And so there's, and I'm not sure if this is quite the right word, but there's a need for humility and for genuineness as you move into that space and openness to receive any skepticism that you get for why you want to be there in the first place. But I think if you can enter in that way, and to your point, find the right person who's open to you learning about that culture and can help bring you into that space in a way that makes sense and in a way that's not hurtful or harmful, that's the way to go. To enter with humility and genuine interest and authenticity.
Yeah, and to not be discouraged if you do come across a barrier or
Sure.
someone misperceiving that authenticity for some of that skepticism.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to go to a place now that you touched on earlier. I want to talk a little bit about autism because I don't really understand that. I'd love for you to touch on that. So for those who are like me that are unfamiliar with that term, can you explain what it means? And
Yeah, and I like that was a beautiful segue because basically some of the skepticism that comes from those
yeah,
individuals within this community is coming from a history or a known knowledge of a history of autism or experiences. Again, I don't want to paint myself as the expert here, but generally I would say that autism is this idea that hearing status, being able to hear, is better than being deaf. And therefore, what comes from that is this idea of someone is less than, marginalized, or at worst discriminated against. And we see a history, if you take some deaf cultural classes, or perhaps if you read some of those literature that I was talking about online and from accurate sources, the deaf culture has, like many marginalized groups, experienced a lot of negativity and injury collectively from medical practices, primarily one, by just being ignored. Two, back in the day, there were things where there was forced oralism. Individuals who were deaf were tried to be taught how to speak and using forced language. There was hand binding, where they wouldn't be able to use their hands in order to sign and have access to language. There was ideas that there was this a derogatory term, but back in the day, this equation of deafness and being dumb or some sort of intellectual or cognitive disability. And just simply because the individual wasn't able to communicate effectively, the hearing person took it upon themselves to deem them as intellectually disabled or less than. This oftentimes resulted in deaf individuals being hospitalized or psychiatrically admitted into facilities for a long time when that wasn't the case or need at all. And so a lot of these ideas, especially if you go really far back, even into like silent films and things, there's a lot of derogatory images of hearing people playing tricks on deaf people, using language as a way to get around them or to bypass them. And that kind of has evolved today to things like this idea. I think one of the biggest ways autism shows up still today is the lack of awareness for the fact that if a deaf individual is of need for an interpreter, it is on an organization to provide that interpreter, not for the deaf individual to have to search out and find it through
Right.
ADA, the American Disability Act. And so it hides itself in different places and doesn't have to be as blatantly today as hospitalizing someone. But that's kind of this history of autism and how it's kind of impacted and shaped the feelings of deaf individuals who are kind of hesitant, although growing and definitely still evolving, to accessibility of and trust within medical communities.
So when we think about it from a mental health perspective, how does autism continue to affect the relationship between the deaf and hard of hearing community and mental health professionals?
Yeah, I think it's this idea of, do you understand me? I think a deaf or hard of hearing individual or hearing differences, there's a huge range. When they come in, and especially if they've acquired a identity, whatever that is for them, coming in, just like any other client, by the way, but being like, do you understand my unique characteristics, my unique needs, and my unique background? And if you can understand that, now I can trust you to understand how to interpret the data I'm giving you through our clinical work, through our assessments. And I can trust you to provide recommendations that I know are at least tailored to my needs, to my cultural practices, if I have them, and to my linguistic capabilities. And I think that skepticism comes by, I don't think the hearing community in any medical sense yet has really come to embrace that idea. Oftentimes we have a deaf person and we're like, what do we do? Oh my God, what tests do I do? I never thought of this. And
Yeah.
when we can work through that and have this idea of, I know that language impacts X, Y, and Z. I know that deaf cultural experience, though diverse, do have some really unique trajectories at times. And is this potentially happening with the client that's sitting across from me? I think once we can start expressing that knowledge and that sensitivity, even at a little bit, we will gain the trust and the trust of the community to come to us to then further educate us, if we will.
Yeah. Could you maybe expand a little bit on this idea about what it is that we as clinicians can do to better build trust and repair some of the harm and the mistrust that has existed toward mental health systems and providers for this community?
Yeah, as an educator, I'm always going to go to education as one of the first terms. I think educating ourselves. So, a little bit redundant to what I've said in the past, but I think that is worth repeating. Going out and picking up a short read, whether it's a podcast like this, which is awesome, whether it's something from one of the many wonderful resources that are out there, from Gala to the National Deaf Center for health research to Boston Children's Deaf Center for Children, all sorts of different resources that are just clicks away now with the internet. Just becoming a little bit more familiar, not being shocked when we get a deaf client, treat them just like any other human and recognize, oh, do I actually have the competency, the sensitivity to go through my work with this person? Or is it better that I refer them to someone who does and have a list of people ready to go to say, hey, here are some people who are appropriate for linguistic sensitivity, deaf needs, deaf cultural practices. Maybe I'm not the one. Here's some good resources for you. So, recognizing what resources are within your area of clinical practice, recognizing some simple readings so that you don't have that kind of, I don't know if this is the appropriate way of using it, but I'll call it a culture shock when someone comes in. And when you have the wonderful experiences of interacting with someone who's within the community, explore, ask them questions. Be polite and recognize personal boundaries still exist, but
Yeah.
explore more and learn and stay inquisitive. I think those are all ways that we can learn as clinicians to progress and to build that relationship and bridge those differences.
You know, as we're talking, Dr. Gala, I think about the kind of profound shortage of mental health care professionals that we have across the United States and honestly globally. And then I think about the imperative we have as clinicians to work kind of tightly within our scope of competence.
Mhm.
What is the community of mental health care provision for the deaf and hard of hearing community like at this point, knowing that there's already a shortage kind of more broadly? Is that a particular challenge for this community?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there is no way around that other than yes. I know the term crisis or unprecedented is used pretty readily in this environment, but it truly is. There's not enough clinicians that are even aware to start their exploration to learn the cultural and linguistic competency to then be able to provide it. And even still, there's not many agencies out there that or organizations out there that provide these opportunities. Gallaudet is one of the major resources out there because they do provide clinical work at a doctorate level or some of these more higher levels of education for medicine for people to train both within that specific educational field, but also get the competencies in culture and language to piece them together. And it's just not producing, it's not a fault of them. It's just trying to produce more people interested and more clinically adept practitioners. This oftentimes leaves a small community who already has some hesitancy at times to go seek various people to very few options. And
Yeah.
if you guys, as the greater whole, have ever had experiences of trying to find a dentist or a medical doctor, especially in this world with such shortages, think of all the opportunities you have relative to someone being competent within these needs.
Yeah, I can't help but think of my time in clinical practice. I don't have a clinical practice anymore, but I'm a pediatric focused psychologist. And, I would get calls from parents who were desperate to find a practitioner for their kid, a psychologist for their kid. And many times wait lists for kind of a general child psychologist or pediatric focused psychologist can be months long. So as you and I talk, I think about, okay, as a general kind of child population, if the wait list can be months long, if you really look at the kind of very narrowed and specialized scope of competence for this community, how difficult must it be to get services for a child in this deaf and hard of hearing community? And just must be incredibly frustrating for parents or for adults who are seeking this kind of service.
Yeah, it definitely can be for a handful. Absolutely.
So if we assume the educational piece and the development of competence in this, I think some of this gets answered through that educational process that you've discussed. But on a practical level, what kind of communication or accessibility considerations should a clinician keep in mind when they're working with clients who have hearing differences?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think the first one, not to rank them in any particular order of importance, but I think one thing that often goes again aside is the idea of the Americans with Disabilities Act and accessibility. So if you don't necessarily have the linguistic capability of communicating effectively, or having the deaf individual or hard of hearing individual help guide communication with you, whichever way, because it isn't always necessarily ASL, but whatever way is effective for that person, then there needs to be someone who can provide that service. And so perhaps bringing in an interpreter. Now that is a whole nother podcast we can do on
Different layer,
the
right?
considerations for that, but providing accessibility to language to facilitate that. I also want to think of individuals who might be in a rural area or in an area where there's not many resources at all. And how do we as clinicians focus on that and handle that? We can't necessarily be experts in everything, but sometimes we are the best that's out there.
Yeah.
And so again, kind of having this understanding, trying not to hurt someone, following our ethics, do no harm, and trying to provide what we can with the limitations that we have and noting those limitations may be the best situation until things can develop further. I will say again, kind of, there are pockets within the United States, but I'll always go back to Rochester, New York, and Washington, D.C. being kind of privileged, and honestly, with the sense of the various types of resources available, just because the community is so large within these areas. But if you go to someplace rural in California or rural in Montana, you might not have a lot. And so the psychologist there, just being humble, being aware of linguistic differences and how language can impact things, having an interpreter when possible, and that humility can go a very long way.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. I think about the challenge of rural healthcare and rural mental health care. Living and working in Texas, I've looked at this a lot, and I can imagine the rural challenges in Texas are substantial as well for this community. I think over half of counties in Texas don't have a single psychologist in
Oh,
them.
wow.
Yeah, so it's a profound challenge when you look at the rural perspective. So Dr. Gala, as we wrap up, and I know you've touched on this a couple of times, but what do you really hope that mental health professionals take away from the conversation that you and I've had?
Yeah, I hope they, as much as they can from it, I hope they recognize that there is a whole community, whole culture, whole group of people that don't have as much access, if not no access, to healthcare. And because we're psychologists or mental health, we're saying mental health providers. And so recognizing that and thinking about what we can do to bridge that gap so we can get more trusted, culturally sensitive, and caring clinicians to provide these services in an effective way. I also hope that there's a start to understanding what deaf culture is. I only scratched, as a hearing person, the very surface level of different opinions and modalities of how someone can understand this community. And so, if anyone out there who is new to this even just understands the difference between medical and cultural models, you're on a good starting point. I think when you dive into it a little bit more academically, you can really go into, okay, what does language or not having language, how does that impact the development of someone? And so kind of thinking further of where can this go? And I think I would finalize with the fact that perhaps this conversation, hopefully, has made it aware to the community out there that also, while this is a culture, there are definitely diverse and individual beliefs and opinions and expressions of individual experiences, just like we would see with the hearing community. And so we never want to just assume that once we learn this knowledge, that someone who's deaf or hard of hearing or various hearing differences automatically is ascribed all of these things, when in fact you may not have that. So
Yeah.
it's more of a discussion and a starting point, and allow the person sitting next from you to help you or help guide you with your questioning and your interventions and the recommendations.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, and I often go back when I think about cultures and cultural issues, I go back to something that I learned in graduate school, and I'm just curious on your take on this, and it's the idea about the difference between within group variance and between group variance, and we always have to remember that the within group variance is almost always greater than between group variance. That we're more similar across groups than we are within groups. So that's part of that humility, right? Not assuming, like you said, that your experience with someone within a given culture, like the one we're talking about tonight, the deaf and hard of hearing community, is representative of the whole culture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this kind of weird duality we have to hold in our mind of,
Yeah.
look, we are all human, and no, we are not.
Fundamentally, right? There's the tie that binds. We're
Exactly.
humans.
But at the same time, we're all unique snowflakes, and we need to be able to identify and express what those processes are that make our life and our experience that unique.
Yeah.
And I think when we look into that with clinical experience, that's what makes us so powerful as a medical field out there. We
Yeah.
can tap into that and we can really make changes for people because it's so specific to their history. We
Yeah.
just have to understand that history and understand where they're coming from.
Beautiful. Well, Dr. Gala, I know we have a few minutes before we close up. Are you willing to take a few questions?
Absolutely. I'll try my best.
Okay, well, so everyone, thank you again for joining us tonight. If you have some questions for Dr. Gala, this would be a great time. Let me pull up the chat and see. I think we already have a few questions in here. Let
We
me
do.
scroll back. Let's see. Okay, so here's one. Does the Chicago School provide coursework for those interested in learning ASL?
So, to my knowledge, they don't. However, I can speak for the DC campus being so vocal about this within that community. I've encouraged students who have had various exposures or interactions with deaf individuals who want to learn ASL. We've had a little bit of a deaf or ASL, not deaf, like a little ASL teaching moment. I'm trying to establish this community within DC to have like perhaps a cultural hour or sensitivity. I am a part of the DEIA community or the committee at our university or our university, DC campus. And so I'm trying to tie in what can we do as a committee to kind of educate or at least in part facilitate these interactions. But no, unfortunately, the Chicago School, to my knowledge, does not offer ASL classes or things of that nature.
I think you're right, Dr. Gala, but after tonight's conversation, it gives me some energy around seeing what we can do. Another question that came up in the chat was, how does a clinician market that they can communicate in ASL?
That's kind of a loaded question. I like it. I think there needs to be a self reflection first to understand your language abilities and what that means to be communicative in a social setting versus communicative in a professional and providing services that are very specific words and that academic language is what we'll call it. And so if you can do that self reflection and maybe you identify that you're more communal or social as opposed to clinical, that might be an area to grow. Now, assuming someone is truly clinical practice and has that clinical knowledge and language skill set, I want to just also clarify that just having ASL does not necessarily make you immediately um, capable of understanding the uniquenesses and experiences of the deaf community. It's the gateway to bridge and to start the work. So, assuming all of that is there, and this is kind of a long-winded answer, but assuming all of that is there, say, hey, I have specialty training in this. Maybe state where you learned it from so that the deaf community can recognize perhaps you did get it from Gala or NTID or a particular program that's out there. You can absolutely market that, but I want you to market it in a healthy, ethical way. And that may start with some self reflection to make sure that you truly do have that linguistic and cultural ability to provide those services.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because as you were answering that question, I was thinking, oh, I've got to ask this follow-up question, which is just by virtue of being able to use ASL, that doesn't define competence for us as a psychologist, right? There are deeper layers to that. Just because I can speak Spanish or French or Mandarin as a psychologist doesn't make me competent culturally to work with those populations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another question that I think is really interesting is, how has working with this community enhanced your clinical work with other populations?
Yeah, I love it. So I'm going to just bias myself here. I am a white male. And honestly, before I even started this, I had a lot of those white male biases, maybe didn't even think about cultural diversity as much as I should. And I will say, kind of getting involved in this community and having the community embrace me and learning through all of this, going through Gallaudet, where you learn the competency, it really has opened my eyes to what diversity means in all aspects. I know I bring up the idea of disability or varied body differences, but diversity in general, being able to talk more with humility more as opposed to some of these biases we have in language. The whole understanding of the impact language itself, if you really dive into the studies and research of this, all of that was brand new to me. More so how kind of what Dr. Garrison had said related to, okay, all of this information that's about culture, community, language can be applied to any culture, community, and language. And so understanding what it means to have those linguistic differences when I do have someone with a different language across from me, understanding I need to ask about not just are you fluent, but what is your native language? What's your primary language? What's your preferred language? Is it actually the language you're saying, or is it some other type of communication way? So it really has broadened my awareness to various types of techniques, various types of interventions, measurement sensitivity, all things that I would not have gained if I didn't go through this experience or embraced the culture that has, fortunately for me, welcomed me back.
I think that's been my experience as well, is that the more I learn, let me think about how to say this. The more I kind of immerse myself in one direction culturally or experientially, the more it opens my eyes more broadly. And I've just found that to be a really powerful tool in my life and very motivating for me to seek new experiences with new communities and explore new cultures. It makes me feel more connected and more like a fuller person in the world.
Yeah, you have a better understanding of humanity and the various diversity within it.
Absolutely. So, another question that came up in the chat, Dr. Gala, have you seen either in research or in practice any intersectionality between representation in the deaf community and the forensic science?
I would need to maybe, if I can, have that clarified a little bit, just like the overlap of forensic work and deaf culture, deaf needs, linguistic needs, or something more specific.
Yeah. So, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, but Brianna?
No, you said it correctly, Dr. Garrison. Good evening, everyone. So essentially, when you were speaking on how you had an emphasis in forensics, I'm definitely interested in forensic psychology. I guess the question is more so, did you see any, I guess, just overall issues with representation and in forensics, and how did you essentially work through that, you know? Because I think with forensics, it's such a specialized niche within psychology that I can imagine trying to incorporate and be inclusive to the deaf community is challenging within that particular sector.
Yes. So this kind of goes back to our bigger conversation of how if we think about just trying to find a practitioner out there for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing that has the sensitivity and cultural competency or sensitivity, that's hard. But now within our mental health fields, we can specialize even further because we like to do that as humans. And one of those areas is forensics. So what you're ultimately doing is taking this very small pool of abled clinicians and making it even smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I can tell you that from Gallaudet, my graduating year of 5 people as a PhD program, I was the only one interested at the time, just my cohort was the only one interested in forensic work. And so you have to get the interests and the experience of those that are coming in to learn about the deaf culture and mental health overlap. And then you have to find someone within that community that is interested in the specialties. So neuropsych, forensics, developmental, other things like that. And there's a huge, huge need for competent clinicians, not only in general, but even more so when you bring it to a forensic setting, when the consequences of a legal proceeding can be profound. And you want to have great representation. And I would say, well, there are very few of us out there, which there are, there's not many. And oftentimes that's another way that audism kind of sneaks in because then an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing doesn't have full access or isn't being fully understood in a culturally or linguistically sensitive way. And thus you now have a legal ramification of that. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it definitely did. Thank you so much. And I know when Dr. Garrison was speaking on the lack of psychology in Texas, I'm from Dallas, so I completely understand with just looking for a simple bachelor or doctorate level programs, they are few and far between. So I can imagine when you get to the level of trying to represent these communities, it is very hard to get there.
Well, Brianna, I'll just put in a plug. We do have a doctoral clinical psychology program in Dallas. So if you're interested, let us know and we'll connect you with someone.
So I do know that it's
Oh,
out there.
good.
Like Dr. Gala was saying earlier, the DC campus is definitely one that is certainly appealing.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Dr. Gala, thank you so much for this very thoughtful and important conversation tonight. And I'll just say for our listeners, you'll be able to find this episode on our YouTube channel, Coast to Coast Psychology, along with a full transcript. And Dr. Gala, as always, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you and your dedication to helping advance the field of clinical psychology and professional psychology more broadly. So until next time, everyone, I'm Dr. Lance Garrison, and this has been Perspectives in Professional Psychology. Have a wonderful evening.